And welcome to Human Potential and Motivation, our Module 1 assignment. And welcome to the world of motivation and emotion. Let me take a moment to walk you through our agenda. We're going to review by way of an introduction to the grand theories overview. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the mini theories overview, as well as motivation and the contemporary era. Then we'll move right along and touch on emotion and the contemporary era. I will then summarize and certainly refer you to our references. When we talk about the grand theories, let me just take a moment to give you some background. The grand theories actually sought to address the entire spectrum of motivated action from eating to falling in love. So clearly this is a very wide spectrum. Also, when we look at it from a historical standpoint, the grand theories actually looked at things philosophically through the 1960s and embraced three grand theories. And what were these three grand theories? They were one, will, two, instinct, and three, drive. Let's talk a little bit about will. Well, will was grand theory of motivation number one, and it was actually introduced by ancient philosophers and Rene Descartes, the French philosopher. And what did it advocate for? Well, it advocated for once the will was understood, then the motivation would reveal itself. So it thought, well, gee, if we have the will, the way will certainly make itself apparent. And it actually focused on choosing whether to act and what to do. When we look at the historical significance of the will, it actually did set the agenda for motivation study for 300 years. So clearly it was a precursor and monumental in the overall body of work. It introduced passive and active aspects of motivation, and it actually premised that the mind could will the body and actions. So again, the mind had the control over the will, and that actions would follow. Some of the shortfallings, or certainly the shortcomings related to this theory, was that motivation was largely focused on one, having the will. However, many questions clearly arose as it related to this theory and what if scenarios, which made the explanation, quite honestly, mysterious. What was, in fact, the motivator of the will? So these were all questions and deficiencies related to the will. Then we moved on to the second grand theory of motivation, and that is known as instinct, and that was introduced by Charles Darwin back in 1872, as well as James and McDougall. And what did it advocate for? Well, it advocated for mind and body connection to explain motivation. So it actually explained that there was a motivational force that came from instincts. And the historical significance for this particular theory was that there was biological determination, and it had two big impacts on scientific thinking. So, for example, it introduced the biological element versus just the mind, which focused on the will. And then secondly, it included biological determinism, which really ended that dual man-animal sort of rivalry. And it focused on genes. They were really the driver of behavior. Some of the shortcomings of this particular theory were determining the number of instincts. There were thousands of instincts, and really they became too numerous. Further, the research reflected that life experiences actually trump the instincts. So, for example, people who had various life experiences, which is generally the nature, those would in fact trump instincts, and one would sort of default back to personal experience. So again, this was proven not to be solvent. So then we move on to the, well, further examples would include, for example, instincts are not acquired. They're, for example, learned via experience. And then further, as it related to Darwin and instinct theory, on the contrary, that instincts can be performed by individuals who have never learned how to perform them, nor experienced the same set of stimuli before in their lives. So basically, you know, how do animals know, how do birds know how to make nest automatically? Why is that instinctive? So that was some of the thought process related to this particular theory. Then we move on to the third grand theory of motivation, and that was drive. And that was actually introduced by Sigmund Freud back in 1950. He was a physiologist by training, and also there was the Hull's drive theory, which was very significant at that time as well. They advocated for psychological drive and motivated behavior instrumental to supplying the body's needs. So basically, the drive was focused on the body's needs and responded on the body's needs. So drive resulted from urging, the sort of urging, and then you get the anxiety of a body function, and then really striving to meet that body function that would be in a deficit state. And this was pretty much the benchmark back in the 1950s. So really drive, the shortcoming, however, was that drive was considered an energizer and not really a guide, and that biological needs were not always linked to behavior. For example, an anorexic person has the body need, or certainly the bodily need, to eat, but their mind takes over and they decide that they do not want to eat. So therefore pursue an anorexic stage. So again, another example would be the environmental fluence. If one is near water, they can tend to become thirsty. So again, the environment has an impact. So these were shortcomings on this theory. Then now we're going to move to some of the mini theories. They were actually sort of the next best thing, if you will. Unlike grand theories, mini theories actually link to specific motivational phenomena. So they were broken up into a number of different categories, and they identified some but not all motivated behavior. So these particular theories were not the do-all and the end-all. And these mini theories sought to understand and investigate. For example, motivational phenomena, achievement, motivation, flow experiences. So these were some of the areas that they sought to further explore. Circumstance that affects motivation. So for example, failure, feedback, role models. And then of course, theoretical question. What is the relationship between cognition and emotion? So they sought to sort of peel off and look at various different phenomena related to motivation and emotion. Now we're going to move on and review some of the next stages. The active nature of the person as it relates to a historical trend, again specifically related to motivation. So during this time frame, we see some of the rise in cultural significance, where the first dedicated journal was actually introduced back in 1977 to the field of study related to motivation and emotion. So again, it was beginning to evolve, although very slowly. And this particular active nature of the person theorized that people are always getting to and doing something, that they are inherently active and motivated. For example, if we look at young children, They're always moving, always engaged, whether it's playing with the toy or getting up, or always keeping themselves active. And another example would be perhaps children playing games in an arcade. It's always the natural progression. They move from one game to the next game in an arcade. So these are examples of the evolution of motivation and the next stage, which was active nature of the person. Then the following stage, following that, was cognitive revolution. And that sort of became popular in the 1970s. And the focus of this particular theory or body of work was the power of thought, beliefs, expectations, goals, and judgments. And basically, it was from the 1950s through the 1960s, moving into the 70s. And this really replaced behaviorism and psychoanalysis as the main approach in psychological fields, increasing the focus on observable behaviors in conjunction with brain activity and structure. So really looking at the behaviors, not so much testing rats, but more focusing on humans and the cognitive constructs. So that was the cognitive revolution. Then we move on to what we call the socially relevant questions. And this gave rise to everyday problems that people face. So in terms of, what were the everyday situations that humans faced on a day-to-day basis in their various environments. So it was more focused again on humans than rats, and it focused on and engaged the social, industrial, organizational, the clinical counseling realm of motivation, and certainly psychology. And examples were alliances with other fields of psychology, so really looking at how there were links to other fields of psychology and not just looking at it from one dimension. Motivational concepts are needed to understand the brain, just as brain concepts are needed to understand motivation. So really creating that bridge, and that certainly was a quote from Mr. Burridge. Then we move on to motivation in the contemporary era, again, continuing to evolve. Back in 1952, the University of Nebraska actually created a symposium featuring famous names in motivation study. In 1987, the first issue of Cognition and Emotional Study certainly was developed as well, published. In the 1990s, we started to see the re-emergence of motivation. And we really began to understand that motivation must be understood from multiple perspectives, including behavioral, neurological, cultural, etc. No longer one-dimensional if we really wanted to get the full impact of motivation. And then when we look at emotion in the contemporary era, it still was a concept that was fairly young. When we look at Descartes, the passion of the soul, also known as emotions. So he called the passions were basically the emotions. And his body of work during this time focused on age-old questions like, what is an emotion? What causes an emotion? How many emotions are there? What is the difference in an emotion and a mood? And it continues to be an evolutionary state as it answers the above questions. So again, very important areas of focus as it relates to emotion. So in summary, I've talked about some of the grand theories that date back to the Greek civilization and our early philosophers. I talked about the mind-body relationships which led to the philosophical thinking, including will, instinct, and drive. I also talked about theories and how they had significant shortfalls and how they no longer appeared realistic, making room for the development of many theories that focused again on specific phenomena. And then finally, I talked about the contemporary theories and viewing motivation through multiple motivational experiences, including the active role of the person, the role of recognition, and social relevance. So there you have it in a nutshell, motivation and emotion. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation as much as I have. Thank you.